If you lived before our time, who would you be? What if you could choose from 1,000 yesterdays, when the past was today and the new took your breath away? Who would you be? How would you live? Who would you love? Living every generation before us, remembering for generations to come, the History Channel, where the past comes alive.
On the morning of August 22, 1943, 8 U.S. Navy motor torpedo boats from Squadrons 5 and 6 left their base at Rendova in the Pacific Solomon Islands. These PT boats were mounting a daring daylight raid on enemy barges that were attempting to run supplies to Japanese forces on New Georgia. Attacks like these were among the most dangerous operations for the Pacific Raiders. The barges sailed close to the shore and were protected by coastal guns. They were also armored and armed with guns that matched the firepower of the PT boats. But in the course of 2 days, the PT boats destroyed 5 enemy barges and shot up shore installations. This raid was one of hundreds conducted by U.S. Navy PT boats in the Pacific. They supported a 2-year island-hopping campaign from Guadalcanal to the Philippines. The PT boats supported U.S. Marine and Army operations by conducting day and night raids on enemy shore installations. They also played a crucial part in starving Japanese garrisons of their supplies. Yet it was not until the eve of World War II that the U.S. Navy began to recognize the potential of these fast patrol boats. These high-speed raiders originated in 1866 with the first self-propelled torpedo used to attack warships. 10 years later, the British Royal Navy introduced its first torpedo boat, HMS Lightning. Carrying a single torpedo, it was designed to strike a target and quickly withdraw. To ward off this new threat, the capital ships of the great navies were fitted with close-range guns and anti-torpedo nets. And a new naval vessel, the torpedo boat destroyer, later abbreviated to Destroyer, was deployed to protect battle fleets from these speedy little boats. The U.S. Navy's first torpedo boat, Stiletto, was developed as a private venture, but taken over by the Navy in 1887. It had a single torpedo tube fitted in its bow, but experiments were also conducted with a side-firing tube. The first Navy-built torpedo boat was the Cushing, commissioned in 1890. It had 3 torpedo tubes and 2 small deck guns. Its coal-burning steam propulsion could do 23 knots, making it the U.S. fleet's fastest ship. Because of their shallow draft, torpedo boats were only effective in coastal waters and narrow seas. However, since America was surrounded by vast oceans, the U.S. Navy decided it had little need for torpedo boats and concentrated instead on building a deep-water fleet. But other navies continued to develop them. The British Navy operated motor torpedo boats in the North Sea and the English Channel throughout World War I. In 1918, several were sent to the Baltic to land agents against the Bolshevik forces in Russia, and a Soviet cruiser was sunk during a raid on Kronstadt. The Royal Navy remained convinced it needed these small, fast attack boats and continued to develop new types. So did the Italian Navy. On June 10, 1918, Italy sank the Austro-Hungarian battleship Szent István in one of the most significant small boat triumphs of World War I. It was a spectacular demonstration of the potential of these tiny boats. In the 1930s, Japan's aggression toward Manchuria and then China began to threaten the U.S.-controlled Philippine Islands. Finally, the U.S. Navy began to reconsider fast attack boats. An urgent study of various foreign designs was conducted, and a competition was held in 1938 to select prototypes. PT-1, with a stern-launching torpedo tube, was one entry, but it was already obsolete before its completion. Elco, the electric boat company of Chicago, bought the manufacturing rights to a 70-foot model from British designer Scott Payne. The classic PT boat was born. In December 1939, 3 months after the outbreak of war in Europe, Elco was given a contract for 24 boats. 2 years after Elco secured that order, the Japanese attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. It would be the PT boat's first test in combat. Twelve new PT boats were based in Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked and brought America into World War II. None of the boats of Squadron 2 were harmed, and they quickly entered the fray. Their gunners shot down at least 2 Japanese planes. During the battle, the PT boats also rescued crews from disabled battleships and ferried the wounded to hospitals. The attack on Pearl Harbor began Japan's massive assault on the British in Malaya and New Guinea, the Dutch in the East Indies, and U.S. and Filipino forces in the Philippines. The Japanese Imperial Navy spearheaded this ocean blitzkrieg, and the Allies were unable to halt their advance. The Japanese were masters of naval air power, and Allied ships were under constant threat of attack. The first Japanese landings on the Philippine Islands began on December 10th, just days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. One of the few U.S. naval units available in the area was PT Boat Squadron 3. It had 6 boats based at the Cavite Naval Yard near Manila. Under the command of Lieutenant John Bulkley, these were the first U.S. naval vessels to see action in the Pacific. Japanese air attacks soon destroyed much of his squadron's support facilities, spare parts and fuel, and one of his boats. Bulkley was forced to withdraw his 5 remaining boats to a cove on the Bataan Peninsula. In the meantime, U.S. and Filipino forces could not stop the Japanese advance. By January 2, 1942, they had entered Manila. General MacArthur, Allied commander in the Philippines, withdrew to the Bataan Peninsula. Undeterred, Squadron 3 mounted a series of raids on Japanese transports and naval units. One spectacular operation took place January 18, 1942. Lieutenant Bulkley in PT Boat 34 entered Subic Bay shortly after midnight. A planned rendezvous failed, and Bulkley continued alone. He entered Benanga Bay and fired 2 torpedoes. One struck a 5,000-ton merchant ship. Soon, U.S. troops on Bataan and MacArthur's headquarters on the neighboring island of Corregidor were under Japanese attack. On March 10th, Bulkley took his 4 remaining boats to Corregidor. Years later, he recalled what happened.
On the night of 11th of March, 1942, these generals were all assembled by MacArthur. They didn't know what he wanted or what was going to happen. And MacArthur came down, and my boat was alongside on the north dock. And they all asked me what was up. Well, I told them I didn't know. I knew what was up. General MacArthur was leaving that night at 8 o'clock, and he went and shook hands to all his generals, and he also selected the ones he's going to take with him. And they all went on board the 41 boat with Miss MacArthur, the ama, the nurse, and the young boy went on board my boat. At 8 o'clock that night is when we left. It was a dark night. It was overcast by clouds, ideal. And there was a slight rain coming in, which is rather unusual there. For a dismal night, but an excellent time of night of operation for PT boats, motor torpedo boats there. You had low visibility. We could not be seen easily.
From Corregidor, Bulkley took MacArthur and his party to Cagayan on Mindanao. From there, MacArthur was flown to Australia to begin planning the Allied counteroffensive in the Southwest Pacific, which he would lead. During the mission to evacuate MacArthur, PT-32 was abandoned. But the squadron's 3 remaining boats continued to fight for another month. The surviving crews, including Bulkley, were then evacuated to Australia. The exploits of Squadron 3 impressed MacArthur. In appreciation, he ensured that Lieutenant John Bulkley returned home a hero. He was awarded both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. When President Franklin Roosevelt personally decorated the gallant naval officer, Bulkley passed along a specific request from MacArthur: that PT boats fall under a separate branch of the U.S. Navy, and that a force of 200 be made available for the Southwest Pacific Theater within 8 months. MacArthur's request was not filled that quickly, but the U.S. Navy did begin to build a PT boat fleet. 2 standard designs were selected, an 80-footer from Elko and a 78-footer from Higgins Industries. Meanwhile, inspired by John Bulkley's exploits in the Philippines, many young Americans volunteered for PT boat service. Among them was a future President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. A training center was set up at Melville, Rhode Island, just north of Newport. Bulkley, now promoted to lieutenant commander, gave the carefully selected trainees the benefit of his combat experience.
You men are about to begin training from one of the most fascinating and adventurous branches of the Navy. A branch in which you'll be able to come to close grips with the enemy. And when at close grips, to deliver a blow with one of the most powerful craft this war has developed and exploited, the motor torpedo boat, the PT.
After their initial training, 2 months plus an additional month for officers and certain enlisted specialists, crews were sent on shakedown cruises. For all crews, these were usually conducted in Florida. Those crews assigned to squadrons destined for the Pacific then often underwent more training at the Taboga base on the Pacific side of the Panama Canal. The shakedown training was essential in molding each crew and squadron into an efficient fighting unit. Particularly at Taboga, the many small islands provided an excellent preparation for close inshore fighting. At first, the plan was for every crew member to become an expert in every aspect of manning a PT boat. But the Navy soon realized that this was less effective than if crewmen specialized in weapons, communications, or engineering. Support base staff were also trained to do repairs in the field, often hundreds of miles from proper facilities. As for the PT boats themselves, the Elko and Higgins standard designs were similar, except for a slight difference in length. They usually carried 4 21 or 22.5-inch torpedo tubes. The stern pair could be replaced with 12 depth charges. The earliest boats carried 2 pair of 50 caliber machine guns, but this was inadequate. A 20mm cannon was added. Later in the war, an additional 37.5 or 40mm cannon was added. A typical PT boat had a maximum speed of 41 knots and a range of more than 1,000 nautical miles on one engine at 11 knots. The Mark 8 torpedoes, which most boats carried, had a range of 6,000 yards and a speed of 33.5 knots with a 600-pound warhead. Both the Elko and Higgins designs were powered by 3 Packard gas engines. These engines and the fuel tanks took up the stern of the boat. Crew living quarters were forward of the engine and fuel space. The maximum number of crew members on a PT boat was 3 officers and 14 men. Their living space was surprisingly spacious. These small but powerful boats would be unleashed by the U.S. Navy in the Pacific War. They would play a vital role in taking back many of the islands seized by the Japanese. The naval battles at Coral Sea and Midway in May and June 1942 finally brought the Japanese advance in the Pacific to a halt. The Allies began planning their counteroffensive. It would involve a series of island-hopping campaigns. From these campaigns, the Navy, Marines, and Army would develop expertise in the techniques of amphibious warfare. PT boats were crucial to these operations. They could maneuver in confined waters and threaten larger craft. This made them ideal for supporting landings, patrolling, and countering Japanese attacks. The Allies began the task of breaking the Japanese Empire in the Solomons. These 2 chains of islands were divided by a channel nicknamed the Slot. In July 1942, barely a month after the victory at Midway, U.S. reconnaissance aircraft spotted the Japanese building an airfield on Guadalcanal, one of the southernmost islands of the Solomons. If the Japanese completed this airfield, their bombers would threaten vital supply lines between the west coast of the United States and Australia, where MacArthur was assembling his forces for a major strike. The U.S. High Command decided that Guadalcanal had to be occupied, and the airfield neutralized. The U.S. Marines' 1st Division had 3 weeks to prepare for the operation. In the words of the Marine commander, training for the amphibious landings would take place on the job. On August 7th, they invaded Guadalcanal. Within 24 hours, they had captured the still incomplete airfield. It was renamed Henderson Field for a Marine Corps pilot killed at Midway. But on the night of August 8th, a Japanese cruiser force retaliated. It sank 4 Allied cruisers and forced Marine support ships to withdraw. The 1st Marine Division had no more reinforcements. The men could only dig in and wait for the inevitable Japanese counterattack. The waters around Guadalcanal were now completely dominated by Japan's navy. The Japanese could now reinforce their troops on the island and drive the Marines back into the sea. The Marines struggled desperately to complete Henderson Field so support aircraft could fly in. The airfield was finally ready on August 20th. The first American support planes touched down. The next day, the Japanese began to attack Henderson Field. The Marines successfully fought them off. But a desperate struggle for control of the island had begun. It would last for almost 6 months. Two days after the first Japanese attack on the airfield, U.S. carrier planes stopped a Japanese attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal and sank one of their carriers. The realization that the Americans could dominate the skies around Guadalcanal by day forced the Japanese Navy to operate by night. It bombarded Henderson Field and ran reinforcements and supplies down the slot under cover of darkness. Those nightly express runs became known as the Tokyo Express. In September 1942, the first PT boats of a reformed Squadron 3 was sent to help U.S. naval forces in the confined waters of the Solomons. Lieutenant Commander Alan Montgomery, who had been in charge of the Panama Training Squadron, led the force. The first 4 PT boats reached the island of Tulagi north of Guadalcanal on October 12th. They prepared for action against the Tokyo Express. Montgomery's boat set out toward the sound of gunfire as Japanese cruisers and destroyers were closing in on the Marines on Guadalcanal. The PT crews sighted the enemy and moved in to attack. Montgomery in PT Boat 60 fired 2 torpedoes at enemy warships. The crews reported 2 explosions. Other Japanese destroyers were met with a hail of U.S. gunfire. During the action, PT-60 ran aground, but was later refloated. The Japanese admitted to losing a cruiser, but claimed to have sunk 14 PT boats. During the next few months, PT boats mounted constant patrols. They often forced Japanese cruisers and destroyers to pull back before they could unload reinforcements and supplies. On February 9, 1943, the Japanese finally evacuated their surviving troops from Guadalcanal. U.S. forces secured the island. The Allies now targeted the island of New Georgia. Preparations for the attack were made over the next 4 months. The Navy sent more PT boats, which now made up 4 squadrons. Their greatest threat was from Japanese air attack. Their worst loss was the PT boat support vessel, Niagara. On May 23rd, Niagara was caught in the open seas by bombers and sunk. But the PT boats it was supporting managed to rescue all its crewmen. Then on June 30th, the U.S. mission to recapture New Georgia began with landings on 3 nearby islands. The largest island was Rendova. The troops of the Army's 43rd Infantry Division met little opposition on Rendova and quickly secured the island. The task force which took Rendova included 12 PT boats from Squadron 9, which had instructions to set up a forward base. The squadron was led by Lieutenant Commander Robert Kelly, who had commanded one of Bulkeley's original boats in the Philippines. Squadron 9 set up its base on the north side of Rendova Harbor. It was soon joined by Squadrons 5 and 10. The main landings on New Georgia took place at the beginning of July 1943. The troops faced much stiffer resistance. The island was not cleared of Japanese until late August. During this period, PT boats maintained patrols to protect Allied supply vessels and harass enemy attempts to send reinforcements. The Japanese were no longer so eager to risk cruisers and destroyers to keep their forces supplied. They now adopted new tactics. Increasingly, they turned to barges, which could get close to island coasts under the cover of shore-based artillery. But the U.S. Navy had an answer to this new tactic. With their shallow drafts, the PT boats were ideal for attacking the barges. They would set off from Rendova and idle quietly off Japanese-held areas during the night, hoping to spot barges creeping along the shoreline, trying to deliver reinforcements or supplies. The PT boats would then fire on the barges. These raids were extremely hazardous, especially during daylight. But the PT boats had the unique combination of small size, shallow draft, and firepower to get the job done. The campaign against the Japanese barges was one of their most dangerous tasks of the Pacific Campaign. For U.S. PT boat raiders in the Solomon Islands, Japanese supply barges were tough opponents. They were difficult to spot against the shoreline, well armored, and carried guns similar to the heaviest armament equipping a PT boat. Five PT boats were lost after shore batteries fired on them. 18 had to be abandoned and destroyed after they ran aground in shallow and treacherous waters. Japanese airplanes were also a major threat. 7 PT boats were sunk in air attacks, but others were luckier. On November 5th, 1943, PT Boat 167, commanded by Ensign Theodore Berlin, was attacked by Japanese torpedo bombers. The boat appeared unscathed, but a torpedo had passed through its bow without exploding. Another hazard was from friendly aircraft, who often assumed that any vessel off the coast of Japanese-held islands was hostile. 5 PT boats were lost this way. Crewmen on other boats were killed or wounded when they were accidentally strafed. Despite these dangers, PT boats continued to patrol the narrow seas of the Solomons. They protected convoys and put reconnaissance and raiding parties ashore. Boat crews also frequently came to the rescue of pilots who had been shot down. PT boat commanders were a determined breed. John F. Kennedy, then a 24-year-old lieutenant in command of PT 109, was no exception. On the night of August 1st, 1943, he and his crew participated in the last action against destroyers of the Tokyo Express. These destroyers were trying to run supplies to an island north of New Georgia. Kennedy's boat and 2 others were ordered to picket the Blackett Strait on the west side of the island. At 2:30 a.m., the boats were idling in the strait. Kennedy was at the wheel, with 5 other members of the crew on watch or manning the guns. They spotted a dark shape about 200 yards away and identified it as another PT boat. But they soon realized it was a Japanese destroyer of the Fubuki class, traveling at about 40 knots. Within 10 seconds, it struck PT 109 and cut it in half without slowing down or firing. The 2 halves of the boat remained afloat for several hours. Before the remains of the boat sank, Kennedy managed to get his surviving 11 men to an island. They were marooned there for several days until local natives spotted them and took a message from Kennedy to an Allied agent secretly based on a nearby island. A native canoe brought supplies to the survivors, then took Kennedy to meet the agent. Radio contact was made with Rendova, and PTs were sent out. The survivors of PT 109 will return to their base 7 days after their boat was rammed. Throughout 1943, in a parallel campaign to that in the Solomons, General MacArthur's forces worked their way along the northern coast of New Guinea. In a series of small, well-planned amphibious operations, they drove the Japanese back. Throughout MacArthur's campaign, his troops were supported by U.S. Navy PT boat squadrons, as he had requested. Operating from a series of forward bases, 3 squadrons were deployed. One was commanded by John Bulkley, who had returned to combat duty. They mounted reconnaissance missions and patrols to support Allied landings. The Japanese fought back tenaciously. Their aircraft dogged Allied shipping and supply bases. But the Japanese could not stop the Allies' steady progress. By the summer of 1944, MacArthur's parallel campaigns in New Guinea and the Solomons had driven the Japanese out. The campaigns had tested and proven the power of the PT boats. But soon they would face their greatest challenge of the war. In the late summer of 1944, General MacArthur's advance through the Southwest Pacific was about to link up with an advance by Admiral Chester Nimitz across the Central Pacific. MacArthur now had the Philippines in his sights. After John Bulkley and his PT boats helped MacArthur escape from the Philippines in March 1942, MacArthur had promised the Filipino people he would return to liberate their country. On October 20th, 1944, General MacArthur fulfilled his promise. Troops of the U.S. Sixth Army stormed the island of Leyte and established a beachhead. Accompanying the landing fleet were 45 PT boats from 4 squadrons, which had made the 1,200-mile journey from New Guinea under their own power. They soon mounted patrols off the landing area. The PT crews did not have to wait long. Within 3 days, powerful Japanese naval squadrons converged on Leyte Gulf, intent on destroying the U.S. landing fleet. One of the Japanese squadrons, built around 2 battleships and 3 heavy cruisers, planned to burst through the Surigao Straits to the south of Leyte, where PT boats were patrolling. The PT boats rotated in groups of 3 to cover the entrance to the straits. Their main purpose was to act as scouts for the battleships and cruisers of the main U.S. fleet. Attacks were to be their secondary mission. As darkness fell, low clouds and rain reduced visibility. But at about midnight, PT boat radar detected advancing enemy forces. This was the main force of 2 Japanese battleships and a heavy cruiser. Before they could close to within torpedo range, the PT boats came under enemy fire. 2 boats were lost, but they still harried the enemy with gunfire and torpedo attacks. Then 6 U.S. battleships surprised the Japanese and wiped out all Japanese ships except 1 destroyer. The PT boats pursued the destroyer. Suddenly, they came upon a Japanese follow-up force of 2 heavy and 1 light cruiser. The PT boats opened fire. In the ensuing action, PT Boat 403 crippled the light cruiser Abukama, which later sank. U.S. battleships then arrived and sank the 2 heavy cruisers. The burning hulks in the Surigao Straits were evidence of the catastrophic defeat of the Japanese Navy. As dawn broke, PT boats searched the area to rescue any Japanese sailors willing to be saved. The Battle of Leyte Gulf broke the back of the Japanese Navy. PT boats played a major role in the Allied victory. General MacArthur was now able to secure Leyte, and 3 months later, on January 9, 1945, his forces landed on the main island of Luzon. MacArthur also mounted over 50 landings to flush out Japanese garrisons on the surrounding islands. Over 20 PT boat squadrons were now deployed in the Philippines. They cooperated with the Army in locating and harassing the enemy and putting units ashore. On March 2nd, a convoy of PT boats proudly took General MacArthur back to Corregidor, the headquarters he had left 3 years before. It was the climax of the war for the PT boat raiders. Even so, the boats continued operating in the Philippines until Japan surrendered in August 1945. More than 200 PT boats served in the Pacific during World War II. "600 were sent to other theaters. Some were manned by British and Russian crews. Wherever they saw combat, the PT boats proved their ability to master narrow seas." After the formal Japanese surrender in September 1945, the U.S. Navy decided that the wooden hulls of PT boats had been too overworked to be kept in reserve. Many of those used in the Pacific were burned in a heroic funeral pyre on a beach in the Philippines. 4 boats were given to the Navy of the New Republic of South Korea. These served in the Korean War, patrolling and raiding the enemy as their predecessors had in World War II. With only a few PT boats held in reserve, their design became virtually extinct in the U.S. Navy. But the memories of their faithful service did not die. During the inauguration parade of President John F. Kennedy on January 20th, 1961, a replica of his PT Boat 109 attracted attention and applause. Two years later, the U.S. Navy's PT boat service was reborn. The first of 26 patrol boats armed with 20 and 40 millimeter guns were deployed in Vietnam. Once again, their crews patrolled narrow waters, especially South Vietnam's rivers. They also supported U.S. Navy Special Forces. The patrol boats played only a small role in the Vietnam War, but their crews lived up to the motto of John Paul Jones, one of the fathers of the U.S. Navy, who said, "Give me a fast ship, for I intend to go in harm's way." This spirit had inspired the PT raider crews throughout the Pacific War. They steered their small, fast ships into harm's way and succeeded in harassing and destroying the enemy.